everyone. I'm Joni Brennan, President of the Digital ID and Authentication Council of Canada. This year, International Data Privacy Day is on January 28th, and certainly a topic that's important for all of us who are working in the identity space. What follows is a panel of representatives from around the world who are committed to focusing on all the issues around data privacy, empowering people, ensuring they're protected, and really advancing on something that's so important both here in Canada, where we're focusing, but in the global village and the international data governance landscape. We hope you enjoy this discussion. And if you'd like to learn more about how to get involved and how to participate in our international activities, please get in touch with us at info@diacc.ca. Enjoy the conversation. Hello, everyone, and welcome. It's a pleasure to host an interesting DIACC conversation today. We're hosting what we're calling an discussion in honor of International Data Protection Day. And so we hope that everybody is planning their activities around Data Protection Day and thinking about these issues, which are so important for everyone. Here in DIACC, we do have something that's called special interest groups. And as part of our special interest groups, what we do is we focus on particular topics to help support us as a community and how we want to move forward to address issues. Particularly, we have a special interest group focused on international pilot opportunities. And so the discussion that we're recording today is really part of an extension of our international pilots special interest group, or SIG. And so, so we're thrilled to have this opportunity to chat. Just a brief reminder for everybody in the room, we'll try to keep muted when we're not on speaking, and that'll help us to manage the audio and such. But with that, I'll ask everybody just to, the first time you talk, please introduce yourself and who you represent so folks know who you are. Let's get into a compelling discussion. So I think the first thing we wanted to talk about a little bit is focusing on some timely issues regarding data protection and internet use and some things that we've seen in the news and in the media as of recent. And so, we've been thinking a lot, particularly about social media networks and the types of terms of service that they apply. And how identity and pseudonymity and anonymity play in that space. We've recently seen, we know that on platforms like Twitter, for example, or Facebook, they do have terms of service. We've seen those terms of service be applied, I would say, sometimes applied and sometimes not, so not consistently. And so we've seen recently those terms of service be more applied, particularly with, political figures and others being, banned from those platforms. So I wanted to kind of ask the group what we think in terms of, data protection and data transparency, and how digital identity plays into these social platforms, and what kind of terms of service means in the context of having a global village discussion, and particularly looking at kind of identity and the concept of being more verified in social platforms, or perhaps being less verified in social platforms with an anonymous or pseudonymous type of identity. So really timely stuff that's been in the news these last few weeks. So anyone want to talk a little bit about application of terms of service and identity and how that's come into play and what you've seen in your experience?
Hi, Joni. Well, I'll kick off, shall I? So I'm Steve Pannifer from Hyperion, and I work a lot in digital identity, as in fact we all do on this call. So I think I'm not really answering your question to start with, but I think what I would say as a sort of preliminary comment is that these platforms, I think, have a huge responsibility. To those that have been given a lot is asked, should be asked. They should expect to take some responsibility for their environments. And I know that sometimes they might put the view forward that really they're just the pipe or the channel, and they're not responsible for the content. But actually, they do very handsomely out being that pipe or that. So I think they have to have some responsibility. The second thing I would say is that this idea of enforcing terms of service. So, for example, they might their terms of service might say, you shouldn't do anything that's abusive or racist or whatever. And the difficulty that I have is I don't see how they can be an arbiter over such things. They can make a kind of unilateral decision that something is abusive or racist, but how can they possibly do that? Because at the end of the day, they're a bunch of commercial and tech guys in on the West Coast. So I think there's something to discuss there. And I think the other thing that we can say, picking up on the point you've just made, is that quite often when we've seen them deplatform or terminate, remove someone from their platform, often it seems to me anyway. I mean, I don't know, but it seems to me that often isn't to do with or the fact that there's been abuse isn't the only thing that's going on. Often I think they're commercially driven. So the media kicks up a stink about something, oh, this is terrible, and then they realise that actually it's going to affect their business because people are going to go away from their platform because there's this big kind of groundswell of opinion about something, and then they decide to act. So it's not really them. I think sometimes it feels to me that they're not really acting because they're really interested in playing that kind of arbiter role. Question about whether they can even do that, but actually what they're interested in doing is maintaining their brand, and really that's that's kind of makes commercial sense. Really, I don't know what other people think about those sort of preliminary comments.
Yeah, great point, Steve. Finding that balance between business and application of policy as terms of service could be considered. What do others think?
Yes, so I'm Mark Lazar. I'm with CEO of Smart Species and part of the Open Consent Group. And we've been looking at terms of service and standards around this for pretty close to 10 years or more, and really digging into some of the issues. And I think finally we're seeing these issues come up in the mainstream, and people reacting to them. There's starting to be enough awareness in the market to actually make a change. And the regulators, privacy regulators, are really done a lot in the last year to bring in laws that are enforceable. And the GDPR, for example, consent became enforceable last year. So we did a 2-year gateway for organizations to get consent going. And I think what's really super interesting about Twitter banning the president, so we have somehow they've stepped up and said that it's okay to all of a sudden ban a president. And so there's definitely a huge data governance issue there. And really terms and conditions, I think the platforms run terms and conditions from a lot of them are American companies. So in Canada, we have privacy law, which pretty much is definitely overriding of terms and conditions from U.S. services. So what we see a lot of these issues really starting to come up because I think we're really nice in Canada, and we don't like to say your terms of services are not that legal here, and I think there's a lot of avoidance of that issue because of the tensions with cross-border data flows and especially how many people use these services. So I think it'd be great to see government stand up and enforce privacy law around terms of services so that they're more safe for people to use. And I think now what we really have is a great opportunity because these standards have come together as well as these enforceable privacy laws, which mean that we can start to decentralize the data governance. It doesn't need to be, people should be able to use their privacy rights and independently of these services, not have to go through them. And I think that's going to make a significant change going forward. So yeah, lots of stuff going on there.
Yeah, that international data governance challenge is one that's so complex, or at least in the current state, it's so complex. I think, one other question I want to ask before we kind of move on a little bit is, do we think that, for example, in Twitter, we do have the notion of verified accounts. Do we think that, is there an opinion in this virtual room on kind of how maybe extending the idea of verifying oneself on these social platforms might help a healthy dialogue, or might hurt in terms of privacy and anonymity and personal data protection? Any thought on kind of the value of verified accounts in those ecosystems, and should that be extended, or is that kind of a dangerous place to go in maybe forcing people to verify themselves more?
Well, I have a view on that. So my name is Dickerson with Digidenity. We're an identity provider based out of the Netherlands. I mainly deal with international operability for identity, but also privacy, which of course is strictly related to that. I think there's an upside and a downside, right, to verified identities. On the one hand, in very free worlds, it would be fine if everyone knows that it's your opinion and who you are. That's fine, and it will probably make the conversations way more decent and less abusive. On the other hand, it also becomes challenging as soon as you get into a society or a country where it's not that obvious, where you can't speak out, and you start to lose a very important channel for those people to spread news. Everyone can remember the when there were lots of changes going on in the Middle East or in Iran, for example. If those people would have to speak up with their name attached to the Twitter account, I mean that would be the end of the channel, and we would lose very valuable information. I do think that chipping into what Steve just said around the responsibility of the channels, I do think they do have a responsibility. Although again, the downside is censorship. So who are they to decide whether or not something is crosses a certain line, or even when something is a fact or it isn't? Some things are very hard to actually determine and decide on, and especially if you have very narrow news channels. So what do you do about it? I heard an interesting story a while ago. Right? So identity providers these days, lots of them we do, but luckily more and more are coming up, have a model where they are not related, or income and the revenue is not related to selling the data of the user, which is great, right? Completely opposite of Facebook and the likes of that. And I heard a story about sustainability, and particularly around electric vehicles, and all kinds of sustainable fashion. And one of the primary investors was talking about how these companies guard their values moving forward. And they said the only way these kind of companies are able to do what they do is when the business model is related to the values of the company. So if you break those values, for example, the business model is around the privacy. As soon as you start breaking that, the business model falls apart. And we've been under a lot of pressure for on many occasions in many different channels to make the data available, to explain on no, we can't help you beyond a certain point because we value your data, and the only one who can recover it is you, right? So it's a constant challenge, and I think that is the sort of red line for all these conversations. Is everyone argues the upside, but there's also lots of things that make it less easy and less black and white than you might assume initially.
Yeah, I mean, look, for sure, these are very complex topics. They're going across borders. Anything having to do with internet governance, we know is a really difficult space. And we know that governments are, very challenged. And you could almost take that terms of service application inconsistency regarding social platforms, and you could look at, as Mark was saying too, how countries apply their own, their own regulation and their own scheme, and is it possible to apply those data governance regulations in where they do exist, and sometimes they don't exist, where they apply to these international technology platforms. So it's very complicated, and important points there, Dick. I think it's something that's fascinating as well as we've been, in DIACC, we've been performing some digital identity-based research, and we also track very closely the Edelman Trust Barometer. And, if you haven't looked at the Edelman Trust Barometer, I highly recommend looking at that. The latest release for 2021 recently came out, and I'll say that about 6 to 8 months ago, there was what they were calling a spring trust bubble. There was a higher degree globally of trust in governments as infrastructure, as institutions. And over since that time to just about now, that spring trust bubble has burst. And and with the research from Edelman's Trust Barometer saying right now is that actually business is the most trusted societal construct globally. So when you couple that and I think to some of Dick's points as well, in the Trust Barometer they also say that globally people feel that capitalism, the way it's been applied has it's been detrimental to society, yet the economy continues to grow, and trust in technology as a whole is very low. So we have some really kind of paradoxical research in terms of what how people are feeling in a global context, and then we have these challenges around how do we strike the right balance to enable, to support governance that actually can be applied to businesses and governments, for data protection as well as data empowerment. So this is a challenging topic. So I'd like to hear from you all about, what your thoughts are on some strategies or what you've seen work, or, in the space of how we know policy is always trying to catch up to technology. We see some interesting kind of raise in trust around businesses as a whole versus government. We know that can change tomorrow. So what do you see as kind of some high level strategic paths forward to striking the right data governance balance, both at from a national or international perspective, and how that gets applied into businesses that are platforms, and how those platforms are regulated, that are operating across borders? What do you guys see as some strategies there, or maybe some things really to avoid even?
Well, I can jump on that. But first, I wanted to respond a little bit to what Dick was saying. I mean, when you first asked about, how verified identities of people, I was actually thinking verified identities of businesses and services that are on there. Because what we have right now is really weak transparency, really just a service name or a service identity, and not the legal entity behind it, or even who the beneficial owners are of those legal entities. So internationally, the big tech companies have been able to get around these governance laws, especially ones like there are in Canada. We have so many provinces with so many different governance laws that they can just go around them because of that, because there's not a consistent level of, I guess, adequacy is what the GDPR, the EU really talks about, is a consistent level of adequacy across internally and internationally. And that really opens up huge cybersecurity issues around identity management, because people get more verified and more transparent, and organizations get less transparent. So I think the international challenge is, to balance that is really to start using some of the newer international standards for data governance, which have taken us, a long time to get to this level, and they sort of provided a single data control vocabulary that can be used internationally, because there are some common parts of privacy law that scale. And for instance, in every jurisdiction, is required that you provide a notice for processing personal data. The legal justifications for that notice vary, and I think the EU and the ISO have really pushed very hard for the 6 justifications for legal processing of personal data, and that really extends identity management. And I think adequacy around the standards or using the standards at a national and international level will really make a big difference, because people can start using them independently. Companies don't have to keep writing privacy policies that nobody reads, which is very silly. And we could start doing things like the ad tech's doing at industry, personalized advertising. It just shows that we have the technology to do personalized privacy policies based on the notice and what you're using. So, we're waiting for code, law to become code, I think. And that's really just happened now. So now we get to go, start looking at the code that is law in terms of conditions, and, putting in, I guess, data governance measures and standards. So I really think there's that side of it has been really suppressed by the big tech companies, like Steve said earlier. They just, they see the threat coming and they just put one privacy feature up to make it a lot more difficult, for them. So, a lot of the technologies have been really suppressed by big tech over the last 10 years.
Yeah, I find this idea that, sorry to begin here, Joni, this idea that from the report that you mentioned that people trust business more than government, it's kind of an odd thing. I need to go and look and see specifically what questions they asked. But I can think of businesses that I trust and businesses that I definitely don't trust. Organisations that would purport to be legitimate businesses and clearly not. And similarly, I think there'll be things that the government does for me, or I do collaboratively with government, that I'm perfectly happy with, and that'll be the same. And there'll be other things that I'm perhaps less happy about, and that'll be the same with everybody. And I think that the situation is that we're in this massively complicated environment, and it's far too complicated for the average person to get their heads around. And so really the question is, how can we create an environment where, I don't know whether trust is the right word, empowerment, something like that. How can we create an environment where people can be confident that they can carry on their lives safely and have the tools to know what's an okay thing to do and what isn't an okay thing to do? That's really kind of I think what we're trying to do here. And so to the question of what should business do, what should government do? I think clearly there's a need for them to work together. But I think it probably it comes down to standards, like Mark was saying. At the moment, we're developing standards in the DIACC and in other places. But for the moment, those standards are being developed as sort of an industry level. We're all kind of experts. We kind of know why we're doing this. Really, we need to get to a point beyond that where the ordinary people can go, okay, yeah, this is a good thing, that's a bad thing. It's a bit like when you go to buy food these days, there are clear markings on the food, so you can go and look and see how much sugar there is in the food or whatever. And people have been trained to know, oh, having too much sugar is a bad thing. I'll go and check, and that's kind of where we need to get to. But it feels to me like we're some way from that.
Yeah, I think yeah, and both and all types of standards I think are important here. National, we've international, industry. It's really a standards ecosystem, and some of the best standards are the ones that are adopted, and so we're all trying to approach it from, I think, similar values positions, some slightly different framing sometimes. But to your point, I think going way back being maybe 10 years, I think we looked at kind of a data privacy nutrition label. And one of the things that we've seen even recently, I know even, myself, and we've seen masses of people, if any of you have Signal on your phone and you've had Signal on your phone for a while, you've probably woke up in the last couple of weeks and saw suddenly everyone has gone, over to apps like Signal that are using end-to-end encryption. So I think, to your point, Steve, maybe some of that is driven by the recent implementation that Apple has, put in the Apple Store that's actually made it really clear, or much clearer than it had been, on how that organization was handling data, what data they would be collecting. And so how much do we think that, so while the policy is challenging, both at a public and a private sector perspective, what are some other ways that we might be, or, what have you seen work? How do we get people more engaged in this conversation when we know and understanding these things? And maybe privacy label is one example. How do we get to that place where, people are more engaged and making better decisions? Because that's also the best policy, is when we don't necessarily need policy, and when people are, able to make good decisions and walk with their feet. And we have a few others in our Q&A gallery too. And so Paul and Sal, you can feel free, I think, to jump in the conversation when you'd like to as well. But yeah, let's talk about some strategies to engage people. How do we get people more engaged in making good decisions about what kinds of apps they use, and where their data may be coming into play or not? What have you seen?
Hi, Paul Theyskens here. I'd just like to give some comments there. My name is Paul. I work for the government in Belgium, for Flanders government, and we've been studying the government and citizen, putting the citizen in charge of their own data. And so this has been announced in September last year, that the government in Flanders was going to let the citizen control their own data. And that's an important initiative being undertaken now. And some of the things that the government is thinking about is about how do we set up what they call a digital data utility as a service. So they're basically like, our electricity utility and our telecom utility. We now have to define data as a utility service where the government actually might have a role to play. But you see that the evolution of the talks over the past few months, because I'm also a founder of the My Data Brussels hub, and that's I've been a My Data volunteer for about 6 to 7 years, and that's how Mark also invited me into this group. So I'm from the business side, and so what we see is that the government has sponsored kind of living lab, an incubator to invite a number of consortia, healthcare, mobility, and to say, hey, how would you do this? And just invite all of the stakeholders into a number of use cases to try to define pilots of how would this actually work. And so some of the models that we're looking at is data trust as a governance model to set up things like commons partly owned by the people, the citizens themselves. They call this the 4P model, which is now the public-private people partnership model, where actually your citizens become shareholders of the cooperative or collaborative initiative. And there are some pilots being set up between Belgium and Holland, for instance, on cross-border mobility, where if we have someone who starts from Belgium, they should be able to travel to Holland, and their data, with their consent, should be also transferable to the operator in Holland or the government in Holland, because there might be cross-border utility which could give me as a user a better transport solution, for instance, as an example. And so what we are now looking at is studying this data governance, data commons models, and there is a self-sovereign identity group, which has DID, of course, as a mechanism, but also is looking at things like disposable identities, which is in NGI, something that has been developed, which allows you to just offer an identity verified for a specific cause and then be able to delete it after it's used in that specific use case. And so we see a lot of that happening, and we're very, I think, very enthusiastic that this is now being sponsored by the government to invest in the study of how this will work out. There is also a European initiative, the European data strategy, where the Commission in Europe has said, okay, this is our data strategy. We want to create a fair data economy. And we also have just, they just launched in November the Data Governance Act, where they consider that the individual, the citizen, should be able to give a consent to a data intermediary, kind of fiduciary that will take care of managing your data for you, because they consider that 80% of the people might not be able to do it themselves because they're not data savvy enough, or they really don't want to do that themselves. So that's the kind of things that are happening today, studying the different ways of looking at this governance and trying to find small test areas. And so one of the mobility, for instance, which is one of my main areas next to smart cities, we've developed a pilot area called the Living Lab Benelux, where Holland, Belgium, Germany, and Luxembourg, which are all geographically located within a few hundred miles from each other, they are setting up a living lab to experiment with that. And that's a way of, saying we all have to develop this open source technology. We have to make it European. We have to be able to share identities with the consent in a, not a really consent like it used to, but a privacy contract, and modern form of putting the privacy contract with the user, and trying to get all of that data together and experiment with it. But the user needs to be part of it, and the user probably has to become a participant in this ecosystem. But that's how we look at it today and what we're studying. So, and it's all open and shareable to anyone who wants to know.
Yeah, thanks for that, Paul. It's really interesting, timely, and aligning. And I would say I want to ask you one follow-up here, which is something that I think we all recognize, at least in this virtual room, that we're going to have different models that coexist at the same time in terms of how data is generated or managed, or how people verify identity and things like that. What have you seen in terms of the Belgian government? One of the things that we see kind of, at least in Canada, I would say that it's fair to say that we don't have a specific, well, we have a Canadian digital charter, so what your digital kind of rights should be, which talks about data mobility, particularly looking at the private sector context of how people should be able to move their data when they're in the private sector. I think that we could use some more work in terms of the policy hook. We don't necessarily have clear policy that says that kind of that public sector needs to make your data available to you in a usable manner, and that you can move your public sector data around, and where the liability begins and ends for public sector data that's issued and for people using that public sector data in different models. Could you talk a little bit about what you've seen on that topic in Belgium? And you're on mute.
Unmute myself, yes.
Perfect.
What we see is that discussion is going on indeed, where what we currently on a strategy level, we're looking at how do we get from the current public versus private market to an ecosystem approach, where you have a different model, where you put the user and the citizen in the center. And actually, the traditional model of public versus private is kind of kept as it is, but you define a new model, which is an ecosystem collaboration between public and private partners, because it's not just a mandate of private to establish a business. It's also something that a government might undertake if the government defines that this is of societal, that it has societal use cases to build that. So it's not, let's say we're trying to leave all of the old public versus private discussions behind and just trying to define the new model and the architecture, the processes and the people that we need to power this new model. And then we'll look at public-private partnerships, and even better, public-private people partnership, where the actual citizens themselves can participate, and not in the traditional way of participating, like getting a government refund when you put solar panels on your roof, but in an actual participation, like for instance, for again mobility, setting up a co-op where actually the citizens can participate in the company buying the cell or the electric cars, inclusive the charging infrastructure and the windmills that generate the energy. So that is a part of what we're looking at, just leaving all of the old processes and the old markets as it is, and just defining this new model and avoiding some of those discussions like public versus private.
Yeah, I think the 4P model is really good, and I think it's one that we'll certainly share back here in Canada. One of the things that we've been doing, we've been very focused on just bringing public and private together into the same ecosystem. So I think we're on a very same or similar track. We're not using the exact same words, but yes, this idea that everybody, these systems have to work around people and for people, and so the one versus the other doesn't really get us where we need to go. So that's fascinating, and I think very applicable in some of the conversations that we're having here in Canada. What else are we seeing around the world? Anything go ahead, Sal.
So hey, Joni, good, long time no talk. Good to see you. So I've been playing a little bit on a municipal level. So in I don't know if you know this, but in Brookline, we've banned facial recognition, and we actually have a surveillance and military type equipment committee that sort of keeps track of what's going on in the town. And in the course of doing that, just as an example, talking about apps, even for people who are on that committee and working in our police department, at one point just saying that you should really check your default settings on your phone, please, and suddenly the light bulb goes off, and things get better for that individual. So in terms of, so actually somehow, I don't know, improving the training and education, and actually getting a person to tell a person. And so that they have that feedback on sort of like an initial guidance actually seemed to resonate pretty well, fully apart from all the tech. So how you go about getting a person tell a person and go from there. I think is an important piece to all this as well. As much as I like hacking on receipts for distributed governance, some of the stuff that I'm observing doing that sort of resonates with the question that you asked too.
Yeah, thanks for that, Sal, and certainly having policy that draws some hard lines, and then also using that networking effect of working with people is a great way forward. So I think we heard a little bit from knowing that we're an international group here, and we're working in many contexts across different regions. We heard a little bit from Belgium. We heard a little bit from the Northeast in the U.S. How about Dick? What are you seeing, in the Netherlands, in terms of kind of people's perception around their data and how government and private sector are intersecting here to empower people or engage them?
Yeah, again, I think it's there's a bit of contradiction here and there. So on the one hand, and we spoke about it a while ago as well. All the people after the latest changes in WhatsApp, everyone's flocking to Telegram and Signal, and Primarily because of all those changes, which are not coming into effect in Europe because of GDPR. So the thing that everyone was making a fuss about is not relevant for these people. So that's the one thing. The second thing is, if you look at the notices of, for example, Telegram, they're not that much better. So WhatsApp has a bad reputation because it's connected to Facebook, but essentially they're all the same. But I do think it's a very good thing that everyone is now more aware of it, that they're willing to act on it, and, for example, remove a very fundamental element of their life because WhatsApp in Europe is massive. Everyone's on WhatsApp. So people now taking steps to move away from that and convincing others to move away and setting up those same chat groups and other apps, I think is a very good thing. Chipping in on the element of self-sovereign identity and being in control of your own data, it's always an interesting one, right? Because I'm a big fan of people having full control and full transparency of what they do. But imagine a life where, for example, the tax authority, you would have to select over those 600 different sources for your pre-filled tax form if they are allowed to use that data source or not. Right? People have no clue on who controls what and how that could also be very beneficial. And I think, therefore, essentially, it comes down to trust. Do you trust the tax authority with a not so clear access to all your data because of the tax authority? And again, in some cases, that would probably be just fine. If you're living in a free country, it's fine. But there are many examples of data being shared back and forth without, the proper context. I know in the Netherlands there has been a big discussion going on between the tax authority and the law enforcement, where the tax authority was allowed to keep your data for 7 years, and law enforcement had to get rid of data after 24 hours. So, for example, the cameras over highways. Law enforcement would pass on the information to the tax authority because of company car taxes. And if and when they needed it, they would get it back from the tax authority to prosecute you, right? So it was completely unintended, but all of a sudden it blows up in your face. So again, it's really challenging, but I do think the awareness is really good. Interoperability of data, that Paul just mentioned, I think is a very valuable thing, particularly across the EU. Hopefully the borders will remain or at some point go open again, and we'll be able to travel freely. And then being able to bring your information across would make your life so much easier. I think also for the UK, and we did pilots between the UK and Canada, for simple things like opening up a bank account. Imagine a world where you could just bring your stuff and all of a sudden you would have that sort of same process or that same speedy process as a Canadian citizen. That would be amazing. I think it's valuable, but there's lots of things that we need to do now that we have awareness. Now we need to educate people on what they're doing, why they do it, and what they should do.
Yeah, there's a maybe a slightly academic term that I heard over the last number of months, which is called responsibilization, which is the term for delegating authority to individuals for something that was previously under the authority of an institution, like maybe a government or a bank. And so this notion of what kind of responsibility are we putting on people to manage this data, and is it the right amount, or what does that mean, and what's policy around that? So this notion of responsibilization, I think, is a very important feature that goes along with empowerment and privacy and personal data protection. That I think is fascinating. That needs more research. But Steve, what are you seeing in the UK?
Yeah, so I want to make a specific comment about GDPR, right? So I'm sure the other folks in Europe will have experienced this as well. So in GDPR, now that it's there, when you go onto a website, you get a message pop up for you to give some kind of consent, and the experience generally is awful, right? And in particular, what you see businesses increasingly doing is they give you a more and more granular form, and then the thing that's really silly is sometimes you'll see like a whole bunch of different categories, and then they'll say some of our vendors collect data for legitimate interest. Do you want to turn that on or off? It's like, if it's legitimate interest, I can't. There's nothing for me to say. They've got a legitimate reason to have it. So I mean, all of this is it's a complete mess basically, and what this is doing, unfortunately, is I think it's training people to go, if I want to access a service, I just click OK, and we're basically back to where we were pre-GDPR. So we are legally we're in a better situation. We've got rights over our data that we didn't have, but in terms of how it's working out practically, I don't think we're that much further forwards really. And so what I would say is really, if we're going to talk about education, okay, there's educating individuals. We need to educate businesses as well. Why are businesses thinking it's okay for them to adopt, these kind of practices, and I think that's reasonable, and I think that's it's not. We have to think of this holistically. So it's okay. People need to be asking difficult questions and being more demanding, which things like the WhatsApp stuff will help to raise people's awareness. But businesses also need to realise that actually being respectful of your customers and their data is going to take you to a better place. But there's a lot of work to do there.
Yeah, we have. Sorry, I was just going to add, we have here the cookies notification, and so you have three types of people. You got the one that clicks through every cookies notification, fine. The one that tries to read the website above the cookies notification and never clicks it, and then people that sometimes are yes and sometimes are no. So the click training, I agree, we're right back there. Sorry, Mark, go ahead.
I'm just getting really excited listening to Steve talk about this stuff, and I think because it just kind of brings up all the stuff we've been working on for a long time around terms and conditions, and we've sort of seen all of this stuff happen in slow motion as we tracked it. First these messaging apps and stuff getting everybody's contact details illegally, and our complaints about this just could be just being ignored, and now that's really a data breach. The way a lot of them have taken, I think Signal or Telegram, they don't do that. So that's, I think that, they actually respect that. But most people think that that's just normal. And, it's never been normal. And I think the terms and conditions. So what we've done is we've worked on something called a consent receipt, and it become a standard. And the idea is that originally it's just that we should be able to get a receipt for online terms of service or a consent or an agreement independently of the service, and then use that to automatically use our rights whenever we want without having to go through the service. But in order to do that, we had to create standards about what really is consent. And online, these cookies, they're not really consent. They're contracts of adhesion, which imitate consent, and they do a lot of stuff in the privacy policies, like put contract clauses in them, like you have to come back and read this if every time you come here, and this sort of stuff. So people can't read that and use it, and it's completely unusable. But in Canada, where we have a unique sort of situation where it's consent by design, and it's sort of assumed, and that the privacy as expected has been held up by the Supreme Court in 2019, and so people don't need to see all these terms of services and privacy policies, et cetera, if the government would step up a bit and be a bit more consistent at a national level, because only when things aren't what they expect. So, when it comes to consent, especially online services, you first, do the terms and conditions when you open a computer, and you first open a browser, and you first see the I agree things, and that's really where the contract or the licensing is. It's not on the web page. So, being inside the machine and having to use your rights with the organizations is really, something that I think we can do away with. But it's been really hard to get that message out about how decentralizing, data governance by getting notice of consent receipts, for example, independent of the organizations, would enable people. And so imagine you're just, so we have this NGI funded project for Horizon 2020. And in that, it's called the Privacy as Expected Consent Gateway. And the aim is really people can get a receipt independent of the organization to create a relationship. And before they go back to the website, they can see if the state of that organization, legal entity in the website is different or changed, independent of the service. So you start getting an active picture or state independent of the service. You can make a receipt for that website. And instead of going through Google Ad Tech, the person, should be able to advertise directly to an advertiser using data governance rules. So you're really cutting out the intermediaries. So we're really looking forward to some of these use cases and this Horizon 2020 project to be developed, so that we can start throwing those in the to users to be able to report at least, is this consent or what is this? And then companies are really going to start changing their behavior, I think, once people can see their behavior and can report it and everybody can see it. I think they've just really gone way too far because they can get away with it. And they, you can see them not wanting to in 2008 and 2010. And then by 2012, things really just started opening up, and the privacy shield should have been taken down in 2016. And it's really gone 5 years longer than it should have.
So let's say, thanks, Mark. A lot of work to be done in this space, without doubt. I'm heartened to know that lots of great folks like the people in this virtual room and many, many others are working on these challenges. I think this 4P model is really great. How do we engage holistically? I really would encourage, if you're interested in these kinds of topics and you want to engage with us, we do have our international pilot special interest group. If you'd like to learn more about that, you can write us a note at info@diacc.ca, or get in touch with us on one of the other platforms, Twitter or otherwise. I'm really thankful for all of you to take the time for this conversation towards International Data Protection Day. So we got to hear from an international group, of course, but also a bit from Canada, Netherlands, Belgium, US, UK. So that's really fantastic. Thank you guys for taking the time, and I look forward to continuing these conversations in our SIG and in another fora as well. I will say next time I'm going to work on diversity. So if you're a lady or if you are somebody from a diverse population, please also get in touch with us. We need all the diversity we can get in these conversations, and that's something that we're always working on too. So thank you guys for your time, and I hope everybody has an opportunity to support something so important as data protection, and not only on Data Protection Day, but every day. Thank you all for your time today. Great chat.
Thanks very much, Joni.